thank you again for having me back, and thank you all for coming here. The book I'm going to talk about is a strange book. It's about Lashkar-e-Taiba, and it's called, in their own words, Understanding Lashkar-e-Taiba. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is not everything that's in the book. I want to talk about something, a particular subset of the book. And that's what I call the Macabre Social Capital, the families of Pakistan's Lashkar-e-Taiba. Is that better? Okay. So I don't know if anyone here doesn't know who Lashkar-e-Taiba is. I think most Indians are generally pretty familiar with the organization. Anyone not familiar with JUD? Can't really see. Well, so maybe the one person who doesn't know who Lashkar-e-Taiba is, let me just give you a very brief background. There is this idea that the ISI founded the organization, but in fact the organization coalesced of its own accord sometime in the late 1980s in Afghanistan. And what actually happened was LeT, who was one of the architects of the 2008 attacks in Mumbai, he had a aliases militia that had been operating in Afghanistan at the very tail end of the war. And he merged his militia with another organization by two engineering professors out of Lahore, Hafiz Saeed, who I think many of you know, as well as Zafar Iqbal. They had planned initially that they were going to take part in the anti-Soviet jihad, and they had set up a couple of training camps for this purpose. But they actually got their act together a little bit late in the game. And one of the things that LeT did was they actually left Afghanistan. And this was a principled decision that they had made, because Lashkar-e-Taiba, believe it or not, doesn't support fighting among or between Muslim groups. And so the leadership, namely Hafiz Saeed, decided that there was nothing for LeT to do in Afghanistan. And this was contemporaneous with the insurgency that indigenously developed in Kashmir. And Lashkar-e-Taiba would be part of the story of the Pakistani takeover of that insurgency. So while the ISI did not invent LeT, once the ISI learned of its capabilities, it invested very heavily in this organization. And one of the reasons why it did so was that the previous organizations that the ISI had been backing had really failed. The Hizbul Mujahideen, because of their Kashmiri background, they weren't considered vicious enough. And the ISI thought that LeT could actually bring some much-needed teeth to the Kashmir insurgency. So once the LeT with ISI backing locates to Kashmir, we actually begin seeing inter-jihadi fighting in Kashmir between groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Hizbul Mujahideen. Now remember, LeT eschewed that kind of behavior in Afghanistan, but now they are on the ISI's payroll, and their behavior begins to shift. The other thing that's probably useful to point out, people who don't know how close this organization is to Pakistan's military and intelligence, we know that the Pakistan Army actually developed its training regiment. So when you look at LeT's training regime, it in many ways looks like an abbreviated version of what a regular military would do. We also know that at these training camps, we have ISI as well as Pakistani military personnel co-located. We also know from Ajmal Kasab, among others, that the ISI was very much involved in the planning of the November 2008 attacks upon Mumbai. So I often refrain from calling LeT a terrorist organization. And I make this distinction not because I don't like using the word, I've got no problem using the word, but I think when we call it a terrorist organization, we misstate in many ways what it is. What LeT generally is, in my view, is a paramilitary organization that operates on behalf of the Pakistani deep state. When we call someone a terrorist or we talk about a terrorist organization, there's this implication that it arose sui generously, that it operates on its own, but that's not what LET is. There are some groups that are based in Pakistan that are less obedient to the ISI, but LET certainly isn't one of them. So if you go to Pakistan, you won't hear that word Lashkar-e-Taiba anymore. That's not the word that's generally used. It's not the name that they go by. And the reason for that is that in 2002, well, actually, it begins in December 2001. There's the attack on the Indian Parliament by Jaish-e-Mohammed. And then later, in May of 2002, there's an attack on this army base in which families are killed in Kaluchak. As a consequence of these attacks, the Indians, of course, mobilized on the Indian western border. And this also then moved the Pakistanis to move their forces to its eastern border. This was a problem for the United States because remember, this was very early in the war in Afghanistan, and we were hoping that the Pakistanis were going to be helpful in our war or our efforts to capture Osama bin Laden. And what had happened when the Pakistanis moved their forces from the west to the east, the Taliban, Osama bin Laden, and a bunch of other unsavory fellows were able to cross that border. So the United States was anxious to try to get this impasse resolved so that Pakistan could relocate its troops again to the western border. And so the United States put a lot of pressure on Pakistan to ban these groups. And we now know from WikiLeaks, and we've known this for quite some time, and this is not a secret to Indians, the ISI had actually given LET, as well as all of the other groups that were about to be banned, a heads up. So what they essentially did was they took their money out of one account under Lashkar-e-Taiba, closed that out, opened up a new account under Jamaat Dawa. Virtually overnight, they took down all of their LET signboards and they replaced them with JUD. And all of the other groups would go through a second round of bans, but JUD never did. And what's fascinating about that is that the Pakistani government made repeated promises to ban JUD after the November 2008 attack. And of course, not only did it renege on all of its promises, it might amuse some of you to know, and amuse I don't think is I don't mean it genuinely as amusing. They even put a line item in the Punjab government's budget to subsidize Jamaat al-Dawa. So not only has Pakistan not done anything to curb this organization, since 2008, despite the passage of many years, the Pakistani state has become even more dedicated to maintaining this outfit, inclusive of letting them float a political party that contested the elections earlier this past year, or that is to say the 2018 elections. So this is an organization that causes Indians a lot of grief. It also causes the Americans grief. They've been attacking us in Afghanistan for quite some time. So a lot of people ask, why in the world can the Pakistanis sustain all of this pressure to keep this organization going? And I think part of the problem in people grappling with this question is that far too often people only focus upon what this organization does outside of Pakistan, right? Outside of Pakistan, there have been a couple books written that sort of talk about the origins of the organizations, the kind of attack that it is specialized in, which is this Fidain attack, which is not, by the way, a suicide attack. A Fidain attack is more like a special operation. The goal is not to die in any given attack, but they would rather die than be taken captive. And that's very different from an actual suicide attack, where the goal is to actually kill yourself, irrespective of how many other people you do or you don't kill. So it's a very different concept operationally for the LET than some of the other groups, for example, like Jaish-e-Mohammed. The argument that I put forward in this book, whereas there are a lot of books that focus upon LET as a militant organization, I'm really looking at how does this organization operate within Pakistan itself. And I argue that this is an important part to understanding why the deep state of Pakistan is so dedicated to this outfit. So let me tell you a few things about this organization that might surprise you. It has never conducted an attack within Pakistan. Not one. Sometimes it gets confused with another Lashkar called Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they've committed innumerable attacks within Pakistan. And Pakistan has taken a lot of advantage of this confusion in names to foster the possibility that some people might think Lashkar-e-Taiba has operated within Pakistan. And in the same way that Pakistan exploits confusion over the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban. This organization not only has never conducted an attack within Pakistan, in its, I guess you could call it a manifesto, Hum Kyun Jihad Kar Rahe Hain, why are we waging jihad? They make it very clear that no kind of violence against any kind of person whatsoever in Pakistan is acceptable. So they actually have an entire book written, the title is The Hindus in Pakistan. Lashkar-e-Taiba, believe it or not, does not permit killing of Hindus within Pakistan. That's going to be very surprising to everyone, right? Because they're so adamant about killing Hindus everywhere else. They don't permit attacks on Hindu temples. They don't permit attacks against even entities, whereas everyone else in Pakistan is very anxious to attack entities. So why does LeT have this very rigorous anti-violent manifesto within Pakistan? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Operationally, Pakistan is their most important asset. This is in addition to their complete fealty to the organization when conducting operations in India or Afghanistan, the key to why the deep state likes this organization so much. They're completely dependable. Not only are they completely dependable, they are an existential enemy of the Islamic State. So sometimes I get very frustrated when I hear everyone painted with this Salafi brush. There are actually very important differences. So this notion of takfir, which is the idea that you can declare a Muslim to be a kafir, a kufar, and therefore they're wajib al-qatl, liable to be killed. The Lashkar-e-Taiba completely rejects this. And what's actually kind of fun, if you have the sense of humor that I do, is to watch the debates that Lashkar-e-Taiba has with the Islamic State, right? Basically, the Islamic State considers Lashkar-e-Taiba to be like a cussy terrorist organization. They don't take them very seriously because they're viewed to be so adherent to the Pakistani state. So the evidence that, and now I'll sort of move into the discussion about the families and who they recruit and why they recruit them. So the primary data that I use to, and by the way, I can have more discussions about this notion of takfir and the rivalry between LeT and ISIS, because this too is a really important part of why this organization is so important to Pakistan. So for example, you'll see within Pakistan, the ISI does everything that it can to give Jamaat al-Dawa, which is the name which most Pakistanis use, a leg up over other organizations. So for example, in Balochistan, when there was an earthquake, the only organization that the Pakistani government let into Balochistan was Jamaat al-Dawa. It also has another organization called the Falah Insaniya Foundation, which also does humanitarian work. Going back to the Hindus in Pakistan, because they're adamant that the only way Hindus can be managed is through Dawa and Tabligh and social services, in Sindh, where many Hindus live, Jamaat al-Dawa has engaged in building wells because there's a severe drought shortage, as well as providing medical services. So they're absolutely clear that while they are supposed to be very murderous when they're here, within Pakistan they're not supposed to do that. So the empirical source that I have for this book is largely these Lashkar-e-Taiba publications that I've been collecting since I was a student there in the mid-1990s. The subset of these data that I'm going to present right now is specifically about the fighters. And we have somewhere between 800 and 900 biographies of these slain shaheeds. Now let's talk a little bit about who these people are and who these people aren't. So for these people to end up in my data set, they have to have met several criteria. One, they have to be dead. All right, that sounds kind of obvious. But their being dead is probably the most important thing that they did, right? Why is that? So we actually know a lot of state secrets because Jamal Qasad failed to do his most important thing, which was die, right? Because of Jamal Qasad, we know a lot about what the ISI did. We know that the Pakistani Navy actually trained them. And the things that they did are things that ordinarily people would train quite some time to do. So for example, changing boats multiple times on live seas. These are not trivial things. And you have to remember that the vast majority of Pakistanis have never even seen the sea, much less been in a boat, much less learned to do the things that they did. So this training that they got from the Pakistan Navy was absolutely essential to carrying out that operation. And the only reason we know that is because Qasad failed to die, right? So dying is perhaps the most important thing that these Lashkars do. And this has an important quality constraint, right? Because this means that they're probably the best and the brightest of what Lashkar has to offer. The other thing that has to happen is that they have to be bureaucratic entrepreneurs. So when my brothers joined the US Army, they didn't have to ask to be sent to Iraq, right? The US Army said, son, you're going to Iraq. That's not how Lashkar-e-Taiba works. What's interesting about them is that they train 10 people for combat operations. They might deploy only one. And the reason goes back to that domestic role that I told you about. So 9 out of 10 will actually be redeployed back to their districts, their home districts. They'll be monitored, and they will be expected to engage in tabligh and Dawa. And this is an important function for the organization because they are aliases. There are very few, and aliases is an interpretive tradition of Islam. It happens to be an interpretive tradition of Islam that very few people follow in Pakistan. So of the 10 people that they train, about 9 or so will be actually sent back home, and their goal will be to try to convert people to join the LAD creed, but also to generate support for the other functions of this organization, including militancy, right? So the 1 in 10 that ends up getting sent on a mission, they're very special people. And we see this in their biographies. We see them lamenting, you know, so-and-so has already become a shaheed. When am I going to get my opportunity to be a shaheed? In some cases, they're going directly to Hafiz Saeed themselves. Hafiz Saeed is the leader of this organization. And to give you a little bit of background about this project, before I wrote the book, I was actually collecting these data to give it to the FBI as evidence, because they've been asking for evidence that Hafiz Saeed has in fact been involved in terrorist attacks. So I put together some of these biographies, and I said to my contacts in the FBI, you said you wanted evidence, here's some evidence. It turns out they didn't really want evidence after all, so I don't really know what that bounty is all about. And I didn't even want the bounty, I just wanted them to do something about the act. So we see in many of these biographies, Hafiz Saeed himself taking a very specific role in picking an individual to go on a specific mission. If it's not Hafiz Saeed, we have some biographies where it's LeT, and if it's not LeT, then it's some other commander. So what's not happening is that they're not saying to recruits, like we do in the US Army or the Indian Army, we've trained you, you're now battle ready, now you're gonna go. There is this constant back and forth. And what's happening is that the organization is actually evaluating the competence of the individual. And they're also taking their time to find the right person for a mission, right? Because remember, LET doesn't commit operations every day, right? So they want to find the right person for the mission. So they're essentially behaving they're essentially using the same skills of human resources that any other hirer is engaging in. So when I look at the organization, I actually see them as having HR processes. They're behaving like McDonald's behaves in this way, right? So the more you get to know about this organization, the less exotic it seems, and the more it looks just like any other organization trying to find the right person for a highly specific job. And by the way, militaries do this. My brothers are army recruiters. This is their day job. All right. So not only do they have to be bureaucratically adept, right, trying to get people to believe they would be capable for this mission, and they have to persuade people if they're able to do so, they also have to get to theater. Right? Now this might sound kind of trivial. It's not easy getting into India. And as India continues to harden this border, it gets harder. And in some cases, these individuals have done multiple tours because they didn't die in the first round. So they're infiltrating and they're exfiltrating multiple times. So what this means is that the people who end up in my data set are incredibly skilled, right? So they really are special operators. It's like comparing a Navy SEAL to a Marine grunt, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about their educational background. I want you to keep that in mind. So what I don't want you to leave away thinking is that somehow what I'm going to say about the individuals in my data set represents the entire organization or even people that want to join the organization, because the likelihood of that being the case is simply not true. Now I know most of you can't see this, but if you go to my website, christinefair.net, you'll see I have a paper where I produced this slide. So this is basically a map of the districts that are producing Lashkar-e-Taiba fighters. And the first thing that you will notice, for those of you who can see, is that they're very much clustered in the Punjab. Right? There's about 10 districts that produce the vast majority of the fighters in my data set. Now there's a couple of reasons for this, I think. When you read Lashkar's materials, you will see a lot of references to partition. So at least on the Pakistan side, the Punjab bore the brunt of those partition scars. And sometimes you'll see this in the biographies. I'll talk about this in a few minutes. It's really important to the organization that the boys deploy with their parents' blessing, in particular their mothers. And so one of the argumentation strategies that you see is that the boys will say to their mothers, you know, Nani, she always told us about what happened in Gurdaspur, about the raping and the pillaging, and that one day I should, avenge our ancestors. Well, I want to avenge our ancestors, and now you're not letting me go. And then, there are these, quintessentially, South Asian scenes where he's doing, he's massaging the mother's legs or massaging her feet, or maybe he refuses to eat. I used to have a fiance in Delhi, and that was a very common strategy to get his mom to do anything was kuch nahi khaunga. So you'll see there's a very Punjabi-ness to a lot of the things that this organization writes, and the reason is they're speaking to and on behalf and for Punjabis. So I think part of the reason is this very clear relationship to partition that they're using to mobilize the families and the young men that are fighting. Then there's also another issue, which is the vast majority of the Pakistan Army's infrastructure is in the Punjab as well. And I think that's for practical purposes. So when the Pakistanis say, we can't do anything about this organization, I'm like, really? The vast majority, almost all of your corps are located in the Punjab. I mean, they are completely interwoven together. And I think there's another reason for that. When we look at the human capital requirements, the educational backgrounds of what the Pakistan Army is looking for, whether we look at whether the enlisted or whether we're looking at the officer cadre, Lashkar-e-Taiba is somewhere in between what would be required to join the Pakistan military academies, what they call long course for officers, and they're a little bit more qualified than what a JCO would be. So they are right in this sweet spot. And so for the same reason that the Pakistan Army does best in the Punjab, because that's where you have the most competent and capable of young men, I think they're also recruiting from the Punjab for the same reasons. In other words, they're looking for the same kind of skill set. But the one thing I want to point out is that LeT is a much better bargain for the Pakistanis than an actual Jawan or an officer. And why do I say that? So, India's having these debates, right? It costs a lot of money to pay the retirement benefits to officers and Jawans who have retired from service, right? It's is a huge chunk of your budget that goes to pay for the retirement of this very large armed services. They don't have to do that with Lashkar, right? These guys aren't going to retire. These guys are going to die, right? And they don't have to pay the recurring retirement benefits to the family. Because usually there's a one-time payout to the family, sort of a death benefit. And I did some previous survey work on this some time ago, and there's not a single benefit that they get. It seems as if the benefit's very specific to what the young man actually did. So if you think about this financially, this is a lot of bang for very little buck, right? They have, in general, a very similar background to what they would get in the Pakistan Army, with an infinitesimal fraction of the cost, right? And while we don't have a very good idea of what it actually takes to run this organization, Pakistan's budget for defense, and that excludes retirement, because they actually did some economic fudge. Some years ago, they moved the retirement costs out of the defense budget and put it into the civilian category so that they could trick the IMF. I mean, I think the IMF told them to do it, so no one was really tricked. But so the real defense budget would be much larger, right, than $7 billion. And maybe the operating cost of LET is $50 million, maybe, and that's probably a really large overestimate. So this is enormously cost effective. So let's talk a little bit then about who are these guys. So the first thing I did was, in addition to, I wanted to see what was their overall education level. So there is this standard belief that people who join these groups, they're poor, they're illiterate. People will often point to a Jamaat, right? And they'll say, look, these are poor kids, poor boo-boos. If only we gave them better education, better jobs, maybe they wouldn't be terrorists, right? USAID, DFID, which is the British version of USAID, and all of their counterparts in other countries, we love this logic, right? Because it tells us that we can spend our way out of this problem, right? We just give them some better schools, we just give them some better job opportunities, they won't be terrorists. Well, it's certainly not going to help with this organization. And in fact, if we do that, we might actually help the organization get better educated terrorists. Because this organization, these guys are very well educated. So of my 800 and change fighters, only 1.3% of them were the Ajmal Kasab types who were completely illiterate. And I want you to realize that that is compared to 31% for Pakistani males overall, right? So if we just took the distribution, these guys are far less likely to be illiterate than the random person, the random male in Pakistan. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether I look at Punjabi males who are urban or Punjabi males who, I can split the data in any way I want. There is no one in Pakistan who is less likely to be illiterate than LeT. Right? These guys literally are the cream of Pakistan society. Whereas very few Pakistanis will have the matriculation, right, the 10th grade. About 11 to 17% of Pakistani males will have attained the 10th grade. 44% of my sample has, right? So that's a huge difference. And whereas your average Pakistani male is anywhere between 5 and 19, about 5 and 19% of Pakistani males will have an intermediate or above. 17% of my sample do. So remember when I talked about all those selection effects? What that basically did was, if I had a chalkboard, I would show you how it just shifted the distribution towards having more educated, i.e. more competent fighters. And I would argue that the reason why we need these competent fighters is that LeT does things that ordinary militaries do, right? If you think about your average Deobandi attack in Pakistan, going in and blowing yourself up in a Shia shrine, anyone can do that. I could do that. I wouldn't do it, but I could do it. It would require virtually no training whatsoever. And in fact, because they probably wouldn't even trust me to detonate, they would probably have an RCD, a remote control detonator. That's what almost always happens with the Afghan Taliban and with these Dawa groups, they don't trust the bomber. And so just in case I chicken out, they'll detonate me before I have a chance to escape, plus I got the bomb on. What am I going to do? Right? I'm going to take out someone with myself if they plan the RCT timing appropriately. These guys have to be trusted. They have to get to India. In many cases, they have to maintain operational security. So the November 2008 attack was different in a lot of ways because they were never intended to stay here, right? They were intended to get off those boats, kill as many as they could, but then most importantly was die, right? Again, I want to make that point. Jamal Kasab was very likely the exception. And the fact that we can't even say that for certain is in part because all of his other Confederates did their job of dying, right? We don't know anything about those other fighters because they died. We don't know were they well-educated, were they poor-educated. We don't even know where they were from. And Lashkar-e-Taiba did such a good job compartmentalizing the training of the cadre that Kasab didn't even know that much about his combat buddy, the fellow that he was actually tasked with killing. He knew very little about this. So this idea of dying being paramount to operational security cannot be understated, right? So why do they do what they do? So this was something that I found myself quite baffled by when I was reading some of their biographies. If you listened to what everyone talks about in the so-called radicalization literature, I should be saying that these guys are rabid, they're frothing at the mouth, they can't wait to slaughter the kuffar, and they can't wait to go to heaven. But actually, a much more mundane picture emerges from the biographies that I've seen. A lot of these guys, they're bored. They're just bored. And what struck me when I read about their boredom is that's what the U.S. Army tells young men, right? My brothers are military recruiters. I spent a lot of time talking to them about what they do and about what these guys say they do. And so one of the things that the U.S. Army tells young men and women is join the Army, travel the world, and meet interesting people, and kill them, right? It's actually a bumper sticker. So in some sense, this is what Lashkar-e-Taiba is doing. These kids are bored, right? And when, to go back to this radicalization point, I really don't like the word at all, because when we call them radical, we stop thinking about them as thinking and rational persons, right? Because at every point along this trajectory, they are making decisions, right? So I would never say that the U.S. Army radicalized my brothers at 16. Maybe I should say it. But if we're not going to say the U.S. Army radicalized, in fact, that's what my brothers joined, by the way, because we have children soldiers. In fact, if we didn't have children soldiers, we probably wouldn't fulfill our mission, because once they graduate from high school, they've got better ideas. So that's why we wrestle them in when they're 16. So going back to this idea of being bored, this seems to be a big thing. Where they're living, they just have this sense that there's something bigger and better than what they're doing. Now, sometimes this does have a particular religious intonation, right? Sometimes we see that they're turned off by something that they see in their family or society. One of the things that they'll talk about, the decadence that they see in their immediate circumstances. What we're not seeing is this, what's the word I'm looking for? These guys are not initially fervently religious. I mean, they're just not frothing at the mouth. They've got other things that seem to be going on. In some cases, they are seeking personal salvation through martyrdom. And so the next several things I'm going to talk about are very specific to Islam. But this idea of being bored and wanting a higher mission, we see a lot of organizations doing this. We also see the influence of their friends in their social network. By the way, my brother will tell you that's how he gets most of his recruits. The influencers with whom we socialize have a profound effect on how we think about things. And in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about the mothers, because the mothers are playing a really important role in this. So there are some things which are specific to Islam, right? I'm not signaling out Islam as being worse or better. If I did my dissertation on the Khalistan insurgency, I could show you similar things that Khalistanis did. But these particular reasons are specific to Islam. So the first thing is, and this is actually kind of, I found myself very disturbed by it, is that there's this idea that once they're killed in Kashmir, no matter what they did, they immediately go to heaven, right? It's a go straight to heaven part, right? They could have been drug addicts, they could have been hustlers, they could have been bank robbers. And all they had to do was go to Kashmir and get killed, and they become shaheed, and they go immediately to heaven. They also believe that they can intercede on other family members' behalf. So not only do they go to heaven, but they also get to pick and choose which family members they get to bring to heaven with them. But this is where some of the stuff gets bizarre, because you'll actually have mothers saying, I told my son to go take a bullet on the chest. This is an expression that they use quite a bit in these biographies. And saying that I don't want you to come back a Ghazi. So a Ghazi is a veteran, right? Ghazi is a survivor of a war. She's telling her son, but I want you to go and be a shaheed. And then she goes on to say, so that you can bring me to heaven with you. Now, I'm thinking to myself, you're a terrible mother. If you want to go to heaven, be a good Muslim and go to heaven yourself, right? I mean, what kind of a mother would tell her son, you know, go and get killed so you can bring my lazy butt to heaven with you? Honestly, it was very upsetting, because I am a sister of brothers. My brothers have been deployed. I could not imagine telling someone that you love to come back dead, because you have a particular vision of your afterlife. But this was incredibly common, and it wasn't just the mothers, the fathers would also do it, sometimes the sisters. The other thing that struck me, and this I saw when I was in Pakistan, is that they would also talk about the status that they would get when their sons or their nephews or their brothers or sometimes their husbands became shaheed. It's a high status thing to be a mother of a shaheed. And they would talk about this, that, you know, I want to be the mother of a shaheed. And sometimes these mothers would talk about this poet named Al-Khansa, and she was a contemporary of the Prophet. And she gave all of the men in her family to fight in his battles. And they like to be referred to as a modern-day Al-Khansa, and they like to refer to other women as modern-day Al-Khansa. So this is what I call this macabre social capital, that not only the mothers, but this extended family gets is a consequence of their son going and dying in Kashmir. The other thing that emerges, and you can probably tell where I'm going with this, is that when you read these biographies, the families matter. The organization itself spends a lot of investment in recruiting families. And again, I recognize my brother, the Army recruiter, in this. Why do I say this? Because we recruit boys at 16, and I don't know about fathers in India. Fathers in the United States are generally too busy having a beer and watching football to care about what their sons are doing. So the fathers will typically say, yeah, go to the Army, whatever, I'll sign. The mothers have to be persuaded, right? The mother's like, well, I don't know if I want my son to go to Afghanistan. I think I'd be very worried about that. Bill, what do you think? Lucy, sign the paper. So my brother spends a lot of time, both of them, because they're both recruiters, convincing mothers to let their son join. And so I was not entirely surprised to see that Lashkar-e-Taiba does this too. And I think one of the reasons why Lashkar does this goes back to that map, which most of you couldn't see, is that Lashkar wants to preserve its recruiting ground. So when I used to work on military recruitment myself with the RAND Corporation, we talked about this as the influencer community. So you don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize this influencer community being positively receptive to what you're doing. So when the boys die in Kashmir, someone from the organization has to notify the parents. Again, I see a lot of similarities to what regular militaries do, right? So when an American soldier dies, her parents are notified by someone in uniform. It's a very solemn affair. Many families talk about that knock on the door and knowing exactly what they were going to be told. So we see that here in these biographies. These mothers say, we knew what that knock on the door was going to mean. We knew that our son had become a martyr. LeT talks about celebrating the Gayabana. Basically, they do the funerary prayers in the absentee, when the bodies are absent, because obviously the bodies are nowhere there. So they call it the Gayabana Janaza. So the LeT will organize the Gayabana Janaza, and it is a large affair. It's a celebrated affair. And they use this to both celebrate the heroism of the martyr, but they also use it to generate popular support for the organization, to raise funds, and they also use it to recruit other fighters. After the individual has died, the organization continues to check in on the family. And the reason for this is I think, twofold. One, remember, one of the missions was to convert this family to the LeT creed. And most of the people that LeT is going to recruit are not from that tradition, because there are very few of them in Pakistan. So they want to keep the family in this ideological fold, and so they will task someone to keep an eye on them. They also want them, of course, to give other sons to this cause. So they invest in this family. And not only do they invest in them financially, they also invest in them socially. LeTs, as I mentioned, they prefer that the fighters take the permission of their families. Now, they also tell families that they have to give permission, right? So it's not as if getting permission is terribly difficult in the end, because again, all of the people I'm seeing are people who did get permission. But we do see this back and forth with the son usually talking to his mother about why she should give him permission. It'll often be an argument that the mother will say, but I want to see you get married, right? And he comes back and he says, hey mom, I'm going to be married to the Houris. Isn't that better? Now, I don't know if you guys know this, there is actually a debate among Arabists about whether Houri in this context actually means a celestial virgin or raisins. Raisins. It's a real debate. I don't know Arabic. I don't know Quranic Arabic. I'm not going to convey upon it, but I'm just saying. You were expecting a celestial virgin. What you got was a plate of raisins. You might have buyer's remorse. Warning, you might get raisins. Also, who wants a bunch of 14-year-olds playing Nintendo, which is what I imagine celestial virgins to be. That's also another whole other issue. If you want a bunch of virgins, God bless you. Go ahead. But the other thing that I've noticed about the way in which they want to keep the families in their fold, it reminded me, I lived in Chicago for many years, in the south side of Chicago. Gangs did the same thing, right? So if your son joins a drug gang, your son's half-life is now very, very short. He's probably not going to see 30. That's just a statistical fact. Very few people rise to the rank of a head drug kingpin. It is really a pyramid scheme. And the drug dealers know this. There's this great paper, in fact, written by a Chicago economist, along with, I think it's Venkatesh Narayan. They ended up, I think that's his name, Venkatesh Narayan. In any event, the paper is called Why Do Drug Dealers Still Live with Their Moms? Right? So basically, it's a giant Ponzi scheme, and the organizations know this. So how do they keep families in the community in their fold after they've lost a son, right? Well, they do the same thing that LeT does, right? They pay for the funerals, they keep an eye on the family, they help the family when they need stuff. Because what they don't want to do is turn that family into an enemy, right? And so LeT not only wants to keep this family on their side, they want to make sure that this family doesn't become bitter. And I think that's also part of the reason why they invest so heavily in bestowing upon these mothers these particular titles of mothers of shaheed, so that they themselves, right, don't have some kind of a buyer's remorse. So I'm going to end. I think there's probably a lot of places where we can have a discussion. So I'm actually going to stop at this point and just make a few final points about what does this mean for India. And I think the conclusions that I would say for you are kind of the same things that I would say to an American audience. This idea that young men do this because they're poor or uneducated, this is not helping us, right? And by the way, if you look at the very few people that India has sent to join Islamic State, they have been some very bright, often professionally, on a professional trajectory, young men. The same was true of the Indian Mujahideen. Many of them have even worked abroad for tech firms like Yahoo. So this idea that so many people continue to peddle that it's these madrasas, these poor boys, that they're ignorant, they're brainwashed, I really want to push back on that. These young men that I see in my sample, they value things. They believe in certain things. I may not agree with their values. I may not like what they value. But what I can't say is that they're radicalized, that they're brainwashed. These men seem to be believing in a cause in the same way in which my brothers believed in a cause when they joined the Army. And I think we need to start thinking like this, because if we genuinely want to think about how do we prevent these individuals from joining groups like this, we're not helping ourselves by telling us things that we want to hear, right? That we just educate them or give them jobs. Now, LET is a particular problem for India because LET, going back to what I said in the beginning, it doesn't operate on its own. There's nothing in your toolbox that can affect LET recruitment any more than you can affect Pakistan Army recruitment, right? This is a paramilitary organization that works with and on behalf of the Pakistan Army. So your real task in any event isn't to retard LET. Your real task is to deal with the organization behind it, which is the Pakistan Army. Right? So there are things that you can do to retard the operational capabilities of this organization, but what you can't do without dealing with the Pakistan Army is make this organization stop existing. Right? And I think this creates a lot of interesting opportunities for discussions, which are very similar in your country as well as mine. So let's create two extrema. Let's say that we stopped thinking about terrorists. Let's just do a thought experiment. Both of our countries have spent a lot of money investing in being afraid of terrorists. Both of our countries have become afraid of Muslims, right? So many people, when I spent some time in Kerala with my girlfriend a number of days ago, and the people I was hanging out with, they would say things like, they would look less menacing if that thing wasn't black. Really? You would be less afraid of them if they wore a chartreuse burqa? Would that really fix your problem? Right? Both of our countries have invested so much in othering our own citizens. What if we stopped thinking like this altogether? And what if we instead realized that every single day there's a daily massacre and they're happening on our roads? I said it, our roads. It turns out when you normalize for population, we have about the same fatality rate. Every day is a daily massacre in both our countries. In one day, more people will die due to automobiles than terrorism from the entire year, right? But in investing all of these resources into the terrorism problem, there's opportunity costs, right? We could be doing things every single day that save lives, right? So in other words, one way of thinking about the problem is to stop thinking about the problem. At the other extreme, and I think there's value to thinking about this too, the other extreme is that if you do nothing, you're basically saying to the Pakistanis, you can kill our people with impunity. Right? That's what you're telling them. So what are you going to do to get the Pakistanis to stop killing your people, right? Do you invest in certain kinds of military tools? Are there certain kinds of technology? But know that all you're really going to be doing is mowing the grass, right? You're not going to be able to do anything about this organization without a comprehensive capability to take on the Pakistan army, right? This is where I go back to the first point that I made. It's not a bad time to be India, right? Your economy continues to grow. As long as you avoid some terrible confrontation with Pakistan, you can continue modernizing your army, right? And by the way, you're going to have to do that because your real competitor in the long term is actually China, not Pakistan. And over time, the Pakistan problem becomes self-marginalizing. But implicit in that argument is this acceptance that Indians are going to die from terrorism. And that's, I'm going to leave it there. I think we all, as members of democratic societies, we should be asking ourselves, what are we doing and why are we doing this? And are there better ways of thinking about the problem? Because I'm going to submit to you that we've been at this now for 18 years. I don't feel any safer. I don't think you feel any safer. In fact, I would argue in many ways, we feel less safe than we ever did because we are so distrustful of other people who tend to look differently from us and who tend to follow religions that we don't follow. All right, thank you.
That was a wonderful talk. What an exposition. One question before I put it on to the audience to ask. Why is LeT not as successful as it could have been in terms of the number of incidents that it is actually able to execute?
So the problem with answering that question is that we are assuming that there was some magical number of instances of attacks that they wanted to carry out, right? My view on this is that Pakistan has its hands full right now in a lot of different pots. And I think over the last several years, it's been very much involved in these domestic issues. So one of the things I've seen is that Jaish-e-Mohammed in this period is becoming much more active than LeT. And my hypothesis is that LeT is being redeployed domestically in that domestic function that I told you about, whereas Jaish-e-Mohammed has been an integral part of basically, it's a biographies program for Pakistani Taliban. Why do I say this? Because the Pakistani Taliban, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and the Afghan Taliban, they are all Deobandi. And so what the Pakistanis have been trying to do is to go back to those individuals who have joined the Pakistani Taliban, and they've basically given them two choices. You can either go and join the Afghan Taliban, or you can rejoin Jaish-e-Mohammed and go kill Indians. But if you're not going to participate in either of these biographies programs, we're going to eliminate you. And so I've been watching Jaish-e-Mohammed be reconstituted now for about 6 years. So this is also why, by the way, Jaish-e-Mohammed has reappeared on the scene. So I think what's happening is that the Pakistani state is actually reallocating how it's using these different organizations. So for the time being, I think Jaish might actually be more worrisome than LeT because LeT has this domestic mission that they're busy with. I know it was quite good, but I'm really late.
Thank you for the way you look at it. I was wondering about the cultural influence that since we share language to an extent, the cultural influence that India could have, because now we're not playing cricket with Pakistan, we're not having like an exchange of actors, and it's a people-to-people conversations that we could be having. How much of an extent does cultural influence have on these families or these people, or how would it influence them?
So, personally, I don't think there's a lot to this cultural influence stuff. Like, I was a student in Pakistan, right? When the Sikhs would come for the Guru Purab, the Sikhs would generally leave feeling, oh my God, Pakistanis are so nice. But I stayed after the Sikhs left, and I heard the trash that was talked after they left, right? So when Indians go to Pakistan, they generally have this really fabulous experience, it's a very kumbaya moment, but I would tell you that that's a very unrepresentative moment. Most Pakistanis do have an existential fear of India. They've been taught from a very early age that India is a Hindu hegemon. So personally, I would never put a lot of stock into that. That is not going to change the way Pakistanis think about India. And in fact, I'm very, while I think that we have to rethink how we think about terrorism, I'm actually pretty critical of these kinds of exchanges for the following reason. And if you think I'm wrong, let me know. But when I look at it, every time your prime minister goes and has a kumbaya moment with a Pakistani prime minister, you better start setting your watch, because a terrorist attack is going to happen, right? And the closest when India and Pakistan were to a serious rapprochement was the Lahore Declaration process, which was genuinely profound, right? Vajpayee, head of the BJP, goes to the minority Pakistan. After that point, Pakistan could no longer say that India does not accept us, because that was the moment of acceptance, right? And you had two hawkish leaders, only they could have made peace. What happened? Kargil happened, right? Which was not a terrorist attack, it was actually worse. And I think it was appropriately scaled to the threat the Pakistan army had that peace might be possible. I also am very worried about this Kartarpur corridor. I can think of nothing. I don't like to get into your business. Let me just put it to you like this. I've been watching the reemergence of the Khalistanis. They've never died in the United States, Canada, or Britain. The ISI has been very active to try to regenerate the Khalistan moment. There is the version of the Shiromani Gurdwara Prabandhik Committee in Pakistan. It's led by a Khalistani, and he's a very close associate of Hafiz Saeed. You will frequently find them photographed together. And in the political party that the LeT founded, the MML, this Khalistani head of the SGPC is a member of it. And on top of that, you have a very bad narcotic situation in the Punjab, which no one talks about anymore after the movie, was it Utta Hua Punjab, right? So I think that the Kartarpur corridor is a corridor that's courting problems, but it's not my country. But so going back to your question, I don't find that those things are terribly efficacious. And in fact, they can be quite dangerous, because what you're really doing is triggering the Pakistan army, who is the biggest spoiler in any kind of rapprochement.
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. It's a mini fanboy moment that I'm having right now. As a young boy, I watched your videos on YouTube. So anyway, so as a young student, what appears to me as a solution between the crisis of India and Pakistan is an economic solution rather than that of a military or any kind of a confrontation. So when countries become interdependent on each other, they can no longer afford to have a war between them. So do you think more of a free trade, more of trade and business between India and Pakistan would be the right kind of solution in the long term to reduce the conflict? What is your opinion on it?
It's the opinion of the Pakistan army that matters, right? I mean, your question is absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Countries that are economically intertwined tend not to go to war. I mean, there's some exceptions. But that's why the Pakistan army won't do this, right? India offered Pakistan, it just gave Pakistan the most favored nation status in the 90s. Pakistan has yet to return the favor. The Pakistan military has been very reticent about having any kind of agreement that would link the energy grids of the two Punjabs. And the reason for that's really clear, right? Because the Punjab is their center of gravity. So you're absolutely right in putting that forward, but for precisely that reason, the Pakistan army will not let that go forward. Now, conversely, what they do want to do, they do want to have the Afghans dependent upon them economically, right? And that's why the Afghans under Ghani, they've been very aggressive in trying to minimize their economic dependence upon Pakistan. They've got now road and rail connectivity to most of their neighbors. So you're absolutely right, the Pakistan Army won't let it go down.
Why is the American government oblivious of what you have found?
आपके पास whiskey है, बहुत ज़्यादा whiskey है. Look, as you know, there's only one country that I criticize more than Pakistan, and that's my own. Because I have the same question. And I think every administration has a different answer. So in the George W. administration, so we could take this back to history, right? This is an old problem. One of the problems, to sort of move away from any particular government and make it a more structural problem, is that I call it the liability of newness. So in our system, our diplomats, they tend not to be area specialists in South Asia. So our Department of State has some area cadre. So if you are a sinologist, you are encouraged to stay in the region. You're encouraged and incentivized to have language skills. We also have a cadre for specialists of Japan and also Arabic. We don't have a specialized cadre for South Asia. So what does this mean? What this means is that people who worked on Peru will then come to India, and by the time they kind of have a clue about South Asia, they're already trying to angle for their next post, you know, in Paris or whatever. So we're having this constant churn of people who are genuinely clueless. And this is happening not only at the missions in countries, but it's also happening back in DC. And the Pakistanis are quite capable of exploiting that. So we'll also see this with congressional delegations. When congressional delegations go to Pakistan, they get wooed. There's no sense of protocol, so they'll meet DGISI, they'll meet the Prime Minister, they'll meet the Army Chief. When the same CODEL comes to India, let's just say it's not nearly as pleasant. So there's this bureaucratic structure where we are going to be not positioned well to handle this problem. And the Pakistanis know it, by the way. And when they come to DC, they have their brief down. And it's a very stylized version of history. And most Americans, and I've seen this happen, most Americans that are sitting across the table don't know that they have just been lied to. So it is, we have a very serious bureaucratic flaw that they're able to exploit. And then you add on top of that the attitudes of certain presidents. So George W. looked into Musharraf's eyes, saw his soul, and did not believe that Musharraf was engaging in duplicity. Barack Obama came in being very distrustful of Pakistan, understanding the Pakistan problem, but not knowing how to fix it because of the troop presence in Afghanistan, right? And because we did not have relations with Iran. Now we have this current individual occupying the White House. And what's fascinating is all of you folks want to do a PhD, there will be dissertations written about this lunatic. No, and I'm serious. So let's think about this from a game theoretic point of view, right? The Pakistanis, for time immemorial, could basically say, President, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, they could say two things. It's going to be a man, and two, he's going to buy our bull, that we are too dangerous to fail, and he is going to keep writing the check. President Trump is literally too stupid to understand how bad a failed Pakistan could be. And he just doesn't care. And the Pakistanis don't know what to make of that. They're like, and you know, all of their ruses just didn't work. But it turns out that Donald Trump's own failings are going to give Pakistan the biggest reward, right? So he didn't give Pakistan a cent. It looks as if we're going to not continue our support for the IMF bailout, but Pakistan got what it always wanted, which was Afghanistan again, right? So if you just look around all of these different theaters about coercion, compellence, deterrence, North Korea, there's going to be dissertations written, Donald Trump, catastrophe in XYZ. Because much of what our theory is basically premised upon rational actors who have full access to information, right? He's not any of those things. Now, he could have access to full information, but instead he watches Fox News, right? And I'm not joking. I'm really not joking. We have actually had his own team go to Fox News and tell Fox News to say things so that he will hear it. I'm really serious, right? So all of you that are looking forward to doing PhDs in the next several years, mark my word, there's going to be dissertations written on this man. But in the end, the Pakistanis win again, right? We're going right back to 1990, except this time there's just a lot more loose.
On Trump eliminating all his allies and China getting the upper hand to One Belt, One Road initiative and getting influence and encircling India in a way strategically. What do you think will be the scenario? Will there be any sort of war which might take place between China and India and any other? Americans will be any actor in this?
So the core of your question, I can't really answer because I'm really a South Asianist. But what I can tell you from what I've seen, because I've done field work throughout the region, what China's doing here has nothing to do with Trump, right? So China's predatory lending in Sri Lanka, that obviously happened on Obama's watch. The deal that it cut to have a base, essentially, Chao Q in Myanmar, that predates him. Obviously, CPEC, which I call colonizing Pakistan to enrich China, that predates him. So much of what China's done to encircle India has nothing to do with Trump. What does have a lot to do with Trump, of course, is his reversal of the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal. And the way things were, had that lady with the emails become the president, because she did win the popular vote, we would probably be in a different place right now with Afghanistan. And the reason is, the JCPOA explicitly paved the way for the development of Chabahar. And I've been an advocate of Chabahar since at least 2004. I've written on Chabahar. The reason why Chabahar is so important, it was important to us, because we could not win whatever win might mean in Afghanistan while being completely dependent upon Pakistani airspace and ground space logistically, right? What Chabahar did is it opened up the possibility of alternative effective lines to move material into Afghanistan. And the Indian investments in Chabahar are also very important for the economic survival of Afghanistan. So people keep talking about the troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. I've been screaming literally about the potential economic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Because when the Americans take their last troop and they're no longer writing those checks, what we know from Najibullah is that he survived when there was not a single Soviet soldier on the ground. But when Russia fell and it could no longer write those checks, Najibullah also fell. So Chabahar is absolutely critical to Afghanistan becoming an economically sustainable state that's independent of Pakistan. And because Trump is so beholden to the evangelicals, I call them the Talibangelicals, he's carrying water for Israel in a way that I haven't seen in a very long time. Barack Obama was very confrontational about Israel. He was a principled individual, and Trump has basically taken all of that back. So even though India got this waiver to continue building one of the berths at Chabahar, and also to build the railway, without much more international investment in Iran, Chabahar is going to fail. And I would argue that you need to be present in Chabahar to compete with China and what it's going to be doing at Gwadar. And I think Trump is going to make that very difficult.
I just want a categorical answer from you. Don't you think that US is the biggest terrorist on this earth?
Well, stop. I couldn't hear a word of that because of the reverb in the mic. Can you?
Well, my name is Prasad. I hope you hear me. Am I audible? Reply from you. Is America the biggest terrorist on this earth? Yes or no?
If you're asking, is America the biggest?
Biggest terrorist on the earth?
Is America the biggest terrorist
Yes.
on earth?
Which has operated civilizations like Iraq, Afghanistan, Afghan.
So
Which
what
has
I'm
all
saying
the
is,
terrorists.
no,
Terrorism
I understand the polemic of your comment, and I understand the anger behind the question, but actually, America is not the unit of analysis here, right? Did you stick around for your question, or did you just ask and dodge? Okay. So, yeah, because I can't see you with the lights. So, George W. Bush invaded Iraq. There were people like me that opposed it. There were many people that opposed it. George W. and Dick Cheney invaded Iraq. Right? Our military is a professional military. My brothers were opposed to the war, but they had to go and fight it. But to your general point, what George W. Bush did in Iraq, in my view, was a war crime. All of them should have been confronting charges at The Hague. Moreover, they lied to the American people repeatedly about what they were doing and why were they doing it. There would be no ISIS today had that invasion not occurred. Taking a larger step back, I would argue Al-Qaeda would not have existed had the United States not insisted, well, we didn't insist, that Zia insisted that it be waged as a jihad. We had plenty of options to support the Afghans. We could have done it as an ethno-nationalist resistance. We didn't have to call it a jihad. I do want to point out that the Pakistanis began the jihad in 1974, and the Americans became involved much later. So I don't like the word terrorist used in this context because my country is not a terrorist country. There have been individuals who have pursued criminal policies, and yet they have absconded. So I can't be any more clear than that I'm not a criminal. I attended every protest I could, right? And I didn't vote for the son of a bitch.
Focused on the point that the youth there are radicalized, they are uneducated, and the policy has been focused on providing them education, providing employment opportunities. So, based on your argument, all that may be useless, also precious youth lives and their total life changes. I mean, how can we make their lives more productive? Thank you.
So, obviously, if this could be easily answered by me, your folks have already figured it out, right? So there is not an easy answer to that. But I do want to say Kashmir is not your least educated state. Actually, if you look at human development indicators, Kashmir is actually better than many other states where you don't have these kinds of... Analytically, I think of this in the following way. There is this international element, right, which is not Islamabad Delhi, it's really Rawalpindi Delhi, right? This is really a Pakistani military fantasy. Then there is another axis of conflict, which is Rawalpindi and Islamabad in Muzaffarabad, right? Because I've been to both Kashmirs, and sometimes Indians will say, we should take all of Kashmir back. Let me tell you very bluntly, you don't want it. You don't. It's underdeveloped. You don't want any part of that nonsense. Right? It'd be like a boa constrictor eating a giant pig. It'll consume you, right? The other axis of conflict is Delhi and Srinagar. And I think sometimes people get, hi, Kuta. I love Kutas so much. So I think it would be much easier for India to deal with the Delhi-Srinagar problem, which is real, if it could be divorced from the perception of a bilateral conflict, right? So because any kind of concession to Kashmiris will be painted by certain domestic quarters as appeasement or conceding to terrorists, it makes it very difficult to deal with that Delhi Srinagar part of the conflict. So this is just, other people have written books about this. it's not something that I can sit here and answer. And I also would encourage more Indians to go to Srinagar and the Valley and just sort of see for yourself what it's like there. I've been going there since 1991. I've seen a lot of improvement since 1991. But I think you just need to go and see for yourself. I mean, they're your citizens. Talk to them. Ask them how they feel. You know, if I can do it, you can do it.
Is there any role that the whites play, if any, by that term? Not just in the militants, but even in people who are non-militant positions in the LET? Or does the LET employ women in their ranks, even if it is the lower ones? And if so, what is the social capital gained by these women?
And that in the book. So I think LET, all right, so to back up, different militant groups invest more in women than others. So for example, and we have public opinion polls. You know, sometimes women are more supportive of different militant groups and sometimes men are. So for example, the Afghan Taliban have no use for women. They don't care about women. They just want women to go away, maybe have more towers, right? So the other extreme, we have LET. And LET has a women's wing. They have a women's, I'm not sure if they're still conducting it, because I can't go back to Pakistan. But the last time I checked, they were still having this women's ijtima. And this was very difficult to do logistically, because women from all over the country, they would arrange, say, transport. Their families had to be assured of their safety. They had to have, toilets, all of the facilities, like female checkers to make sure that there wasn't, that people were who they say they were, and so forth. So an organization only, I take the view that organizations are rational. They only make investments when they expect a return. And so at these women's ijtimas, you'll have mothers of shaheeds explaining what their sons did, why they're proud of them, making the usual statements that they'll send more sons, every son they have, they'll send. The other thing that these women seem to, by virtue of being associated with LET, they gain mobility, right? So, I was a student in Lahore. The women that I lived with, the woman that I lived with, she never stepped out of her house, not even to go buy subsidy. So what would happen in the morning, this young man, about 9 or 10, he would come up to the dahliz, the doorstep. Sorry, I'm watching menopause. I got menopause brain. Would come to the doorstep, and she would tell him what she wanted for the day, and she would give him the money, and then he would return with the groceries with the change. And he was a prepubescent young man. So she didn't even go outside to buy groceries. And this was just an ordinary house that lived in the old city of Lahore. These women, in contrast, they move around very freely. They go, they collect funds, they distribute, they have a specific women's magazine. Now, of course, how they do this is that they tend to wear, niqab, a hijab. Often they'll also wear socks and gloves. So this gives them this mobility to move around in ways that would not have been available to them had they not been associated with LET. So I would say, and I remember, having argument. I don't argue. It's not my business. I don't care. But people would argue to me, because they know I'm a secularist, that this is in fact a form of feminism, right? That by being completely invisible as a sexual object to men, that they were able to gain access in mobility. And I'm like, well, if you didn't have dudes that were, potentially compromising your honor, this wouldn't be a problem in the first place, but it's not my country, I'm not going to argue that. Especially coming from the United States, which has a very robust rape culture itself, including, apparently, the president. So, he did. He's the pussy grabber who boasted about it. I mean, those are his words, we all heard him say it. So, yeah, and then the Supreme Court justice, who also is a rapist. So great. But going to your point, yeah, by being associated with this organization, they are very much empowered in ways that they probably would not be were they not a part of the organization? And I think that's an important part of this puzzle of why women are attracted to it. They're not the only organization that does this. When I was a student in Pakistan, I met nuns. And these nuns, in many cases, were converts to Catholicism because they didn't want to have arranged marriage. They all had different reasons. But what they could do as nuns, and nuns, had a very specific outfit, a blue shalwar kameez, the white habit, and a white dupatta. They moved all over Pakistan. And these women in Lashkar, they really do remind me of these nuns. So they're getting to do things that they would never ordinarily be able to do, and this is rewarding for them in its own right.
We'll take 2 more questions. Derive.
Hi, Chris. Loved your first book, of course. I'd recommend it to anybody who's here. Since I picked up a copy of your book, I saw on the back that there's a blurb by AU Steve Tankel. And I just want to bring one point up. In that book, he basically says, Musharraf, he may not have dismantled LET, JEM networks and whatnot, but he made it hard for them to operate. To what extent do you agree or disagree with that? And second, through your research, did you consult a lot of conspiracy theory-ridden newspapers like Nawaya and whatnot for the book?
All right, so Steve is a friend, right? So Steve and I, we're different kinds of scholars, right? I tend to not believe anything anyone tells me. So my Pakistan Army book's the same way. I spent a lot of time with the Pakistan Army, but I know they lie all the time, right? So instead, I rely upon the texts. Those texts that they wrote were for themselves, circulated amongst themselves. And so one of the things about Stephen's book, he spoke to people that were allegedly members of that organization. Stephen doesn't have language skills, right? And by the way, Steve Cole is guilty of the same thing. And I was in a meeting with Steve Cole, with a very senior U.S. official, and Steve Cole said that Lashkar-e-Taiba told him they were no longer taking money from the ISI. And I just flat out told him, because they never told you that. One, they would never tell you that, because they admitted that they were doing it. And B, who told you that? Did your translator tell you this? Because then your translator is just taking you for a ride. So the problem with Steve Cole and Steve Tankel, when you don't have those language skills and you're completely reliant upon a translator, you don't know who's doing the lying, right? But there's a lot of things in their writings that I know for a fact no one would have said, right? So I can't tell. So I'm not going to deprecate the work that Stephen did, because Stephen did a lot of work. But let's just say I don't agree with that claim. I know that that was a very popular claim that was made. What Musharraf did do, and I think this is where Steve and I depart. Steve only looks at what the organization does abroad. I look at what the organization does within Pakistan. What we did see is that in that period, the organization was doing a lot of relief following the earthquake, right? So they were essentially redeployed to this domestic mission. And this did cause the organization to have some grief, because when you join a group like this, what you really want to do is you want to go and fight, right? And so some people were disgruntled. So Musharraf did not dismantle the organization, but he did try to reduce the footprint of the organizations. And so one thing, I'll tell you one change that did happen, right? And so prior to Musharraf, the launching pads would be much larger, and the insertion packets would be huge. Like they'd be inserting 90 people or so. During the Musharraf period, the insertion packets, as they call them, was maybe 10 or 15 people. So it's somewhere between what Musharraf said and then what actually happened. He certainly didn't clamp down on the organization. They were just simply redeployed to other missions. And then on the Dawa front, they all moved to Afghanistan, right? So if you were Daesh and you wanted to get your jihad on, you were just dispatched to go fight the Taliban. And of course, this is that time period when Americans were very ignorant of what the Taliban were doing. But the Taliban were completely reconfiguring themselves to take the fight to the Americans.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to Nigeria. In one of your earlier speeches, you suggested that India should also go for sub-conventional options. So could you elaborate on that?
I didn't hear what you said.
So you suggested that India should go for sub-conventional options.
Oh yeah.
So can you elaborate on that? And another question is, even after providing more than $34 billion to Pakistan, it has still provided safe havens to terrorist troops. And it has even sheltered Osama. So when you are not able to convince your own ally to dismantle terrorist networks in Pakistan, how can you hope that Taliban would not provide safe havens in Afghanistan in the future?
Obviously, I agree with you. I mean, we're in violent agreement. It's mystifying to me. But going to the first thing, so you have to think about what I'll call full-scale deterrence, right? So India will often talk about conventional deterrence, and that's where both India and Pakistan consider the size of their forces, the doctrine, the kinds of war-fighting scenarios that they might confront. You also have nuclear deterrence. This is when countries think about the size of their nuclear arsenal. Within the arsenal, different sizes of warheads and different means of delivery. So India will talk about a triad, right? Which is talking about sea-based, sky-based, as well as land-based nuclear assets. Well, another part of full-scale deterrence is sub-conventional deterrence, right? So right now, Pakistan exploits its nuclear umbrella to use these terrorist groups to kill Indians. India also could use its nuclear umbrella to return the favor. Now, there's costs and the benefits of this. So morally, you run into this risk of being conflated with Pakistan, right? Engaging in a proxy war. And so that's why it's really important that you think about who your targets are, right? Pakistan kills, through its proxies, generally civilians. Well, I mean, that's not, I shouldn't say generally. It kills civilians as well as military personnel. So why couldn't India use sub-conventional attacks to take on hard targets, right? That way India doesn't fall into the moral equivalency of being equated with Pakistan. That has the advantage of imposing costs upon Pakistan in a way that India doesn't do at present. Now, there's one important thing about covert operations. They have to remain covert. You don't make movies about it to get people elected. You don't do that stuff, right? It's just that's not how it's done. And generally, Indians have to understand that just like everyone else, like I know that the CIA does stuff. I may not personally approve of it, but I should only hear about it when things go bad, right? I should never hear about it when they do something good. And obviously, taking out Osama bin Laden, all right, we'll applaud that. But on quotidian sub-conventional operations, I should never know about it. It certainly shouldn't be made into a movie, shouldn't be politicized, right? These are tools of statecraft. However, when things go wrong, we must debate it, right? Because when things go wrong, we then realize that our countries are putting people into harm's way, and we have to ask ourselves, was this worth the risk that they took? And were they properly equipped? So my friend Praveen Swami got a lot of grief for writing about the Yadav situation. If you're not aware of it, Google him. I deleted the article down, I don't know. But the reason why he wrote that article was that he wanted Indians to know, A, this went very, very badly. That here's a guy, he's put in harm's way, and he wasn't properly equipped. So again, this is a much longer discussion. I think it's a part of full spectrum deterrence. I think that India should be doing it, but India has to be very cautious in the proxies that it employs, and it has to be very careful of the targets that it picks, and they have to stay covert. Like that's how this game is played. Called covert operations for a reason. By the way, in U.S. law, we have this defined statutorily, right? So we have two kinds of operations that will happen in the U.S., and they're different. One is covert, which means you don't talk about it. Technically, the drill program in Pakistan is covert. The other statute is clandestine. Clandestine can, under some circumstances, be talked about. So this is also an area where, by having a more public discussion about these operations, thinking about what are the different legal statutes under which different kinds of operations can be conducted. And those are very important because we have to trust that our government is behaving legally, right? And so one of the issues that the drone program stimulated was a lot of question about whether or not we are operating within our law. And so having legal frameworks gives us a place where we can begin having those discussions. But without a legal framework, you don't know even where to begin with that kind of a discussion. Oh, well, I told you, I agree with you. So, I mean, there's nothing to say. I mean, you said it, I could repeat it, but I agree with you. It's silly.
We'll take the last.
आप हिंदी और उर्दू जानती हैं, तो मैं आपसे उसी में बात करना चाहता हूँ।
ठीक है, जी आपकी मर्जी।
Thank you.
और कैसे हुआ? तुम्हारे पर पंजाबी।
आपने कहा हिजबुल मुजाहिदीन और जैश मोहम्मद इनका जो लिंक है वो ये देवबंदी है बोल के कहा।
No, no. मैंने ऐसा नहीं कहा। मैंने कहा कि जैश मोहम्मद देवबंदी तो हैं। हिजबुल मुजाहिदीन जमात इस्लामी से ताल्लुक रखते हैं। तो ये बिल्कुल अलग है।
जो जैश मोहम्मद और इन दोनों को आपने जो देवबंदी कहा है, ये देवबंद ये इंडिया में है। तो आपने ये जो लिंक किया है, ये किस तरीके से आपने लिंक किया है मैं जानना चाहता हूँ। और एक दूसरा ये था।
So what he's asking is, this is a complicated one, and many Indians should actually be, asking Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. So Deoband is in India. So he's asking, I said that Jaish Mohammed is Deobandi, but Deoband is in India, so how can Jaish Mohammed be Deobandi? Well, at partition, I'm sure some of you know this, at partition, the ulama disagreed about partition. And their argument was that we would be dividing the ummah, that partition is bad for ummah. So all of the major organizations, a lot of ulama disagreed. But ultimately, once partition happened, those ulama who wanted to be Pakistan, they went to Pakistan. And then they ex post facto rationalized partition. The same thing would play out in 1971 when the same ulama did not agree with the breakup of Pakistan, but you still had those ulama in what would become Bangladesh. They stayed, and then they ex post facto rationalized. So the Deoband that you have in Pakistan, they call themselves Deobandi. Many of the historical mosques and madrasas have the lineage of the instructors going back to Deoband. So that silsila is still there. But whereas Deoband in India is very pro-state and very anti-violence, Deobandis in Pakistan are quite different. They might have a lot in common in terms of this tradition, this silsila, but they politically are quite different. Unfortunately, the the Afghan Taliban did not come from Deobandi madrasas in India. We would have a very different Taliban had they. They came from Deobandi madrasas in Pakistan. In fact, for many years, I was suggesting to various ambassadors, Indian ambassadors I met in Afghanistan, you should really be bringing the ulama from Afghanistan to Deoband, right? Instead of letting them go to Pakistan for their training, because that's bad news for everyone. But if we could get the aspiring alums in Afghanistan to come here, we would have had a very different set of ulama in Afghanistan. I understand the sentiment, but they're called Deobandi because they do come from that tradition. They're Hanafi. They still use the same references for fiqh. It's just that when it comes to politics and violence, they're very different from your Deoband. Are you Deobandi?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Asking a single question.
No, just a question, please.
I can't ask you a question because there's too much to discuss. I've been working for the Muslims of India with them for more than 50 years. And they are the most disgusted, most wonderful, most loyal people, most stupid, and yet intelligent as any country.
I think that's just called a citizen.
Sorry?
I think that's just a citizen.
No, I'm a Muslim, let me tell you this, okay? I'm a big Muslim, and I have worked with them for quite a bit. Now we have more madrasas in India than you have in Pakistan. In fact, there are more madrasas here than you have Pakistani cities. I'm not worried about Pakistan. I hope and think it will die its own death. I'm more worried about the Buddhist just now. The Devapati concept of India is less violent. Now here, I speak to the audience here. I have interacted.
I think you need to make it crisp.
Okay. I have worked with the police department in Maharashtra. There are 18,000 madrasas under surveillance. So they're not just surveying them as criminals. They're treating them as equals and as friends, and they're helping them. And that is what's happening good in our country, that the majority community is trying to carry the minority community.
I got nothing. But you know, I want to go back to your point, sir. So, I mean, I've done also a lot of studies about India's Muslims. And the one thing that I've observed as a scholar, and by the way, I'm an atheist, I have no cat in the Sky Tyrant fight. I just watch them all. There is no Muslim India. The communities here are so diverse, right? I'm struck by when I go to Kerala, obviously a Muslim in Kerala has more in common with her Hindu neighbor than a Muslim counterpart in Uttar Pradesh, right? And so, as I often find myself being besieged by proponents of certain political parties, and they like to use this language of secularist and appeasement. I call myself very happily a libtard secularist. I'm happy to take that on. Because what I actually see is just the opposite of appeasement. So when I look at the data, and I look at the data, by what are the data, India census data, there's a lot of variation across states. And in most states, Kerala is an exception, a very notable exception. Why is Kerala such an exception? Well, because you have a Muslim league, and you had communists that have gone back and forth in the Ministry of Education, right? And so when I look at the case story of Kerala, it's an interesting one. They're some of the most well-educated Muslims that India has. But when you look at the education, the employment statistics, you don't see a return to that investment in Kerala. So they are going outside of this country to get jobs. And I think that's part of why we are seeing this transformation that certainly I've observed in my lifetime in Kerala, right? And it is very curious to me that the state, which singularly has the most well-educated Muslims in the Indian unit, is largely the state that's exporting Islamic State fighters, right? That's very puzzling, right? So, I think there's more to it than what you're talking about. Some states do, I'm very glad that the Maharashtra police in your experience behave this way. I've had interactions with police that quite frankly scared the crap out of me and how they talked about Muslims. That reminded me of how my police think about and act towards African Americans. In fact, that's frequently the parallel that I find myself coming to. And people say the same thing. They'll say, well, you know, Muslims here, they're great cricket stars and they're great Bollywood stars. I'm like, well, that's what a racist says in the United States about African Americans. Right? We've got Will Smith and we've got these. So I think it's much more complicated than that. And I think there's much more work to be done. If you look at the data, usually in most of the states in terms of human capital, Muslims fall between OBCs and scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In most states. The other thing that we're observing for Muslims in this country is that for most of the other groups, there's upward social mobility, meaning that your children will be economically better off than you. In most of the Muslim communities, we're not seeing that here. Whereas in even OBCs and SCTs, there is upward social mobility. So I wish that Indians could have a conversation about this that's data-driven, and just by talking about the data, as soon as this thing gets uploaded, I'm going to be besieged by bucks. I'm going to be called an appeaser. I know exactly the words I'm going to be called. But I don't care, because I'll use the words right back at them that they don't want to be called. But we need to have a data discussion, and data should drive policy. Right? I don't see that discussion happening.
Christine, thank you very, very much. That was wonderful. Thank you.